Hello and welcome to the Clearer Roads, Cleaner Air webinar. This is part of the Landor LINKS traffic and parking webinar series. Ringo is today's sponsor, so thanks very much to them. And of course, thank you to you all for joining. My name is Lewis Ray. I'm the chair for today. I'm the director of WSP's parking, tolling and road user charging systems business. We are active in the clean air zone and low emission zone sector, where our systems are used to enforce the biggest UK schemes. The ongoing coronavirus pandemic and the government imposed restrictions have given rise to a dramatic decline in vehicle emissions and a subsequent significant improvement in air quality. The challenge now is to maintain these improvements, and this is something that central and local government is working hard at, supported by the private sector. Today's session will look at some of the things that are being done. We have lined up 3 experts to give presentations to you today. First, we'll hear from John Sureau. John is the Director of Economics at Jacobs. Secondly, we have a presentation from Dave Pye. Dave is the lead consultant at Capital Traffic Management and Parking Limited, and he works closely on numerous projects with local government. Finally, we'll hear from Pete O'Driscoll. Pete is the Managing Director of Ringo. Ringo is the leading cashless parking system provider, and Pete is at the forefront of their thinking on how technology can be used to deliver improvements in air quality. There will be opportunity for a question and answer session at the end. But please do use the question box function, which is on the right of your screen, at any time during today's webinar to submit a question so that we have the list ready for the Q&A section. And finally, if you're tweeting about the event today, then please use the hashtag traffic and parking. So thanks again for joining, and I'll now pass over to John Sureau, who will give our first presentation.
Thank you, Lewis. So I'm an economist. Economists tend to look at the world slightly differently than many other people. And what I'm going to do is provide some context as to what's been happening and some ideas as to how things might go forward from here. So what we've seen over the last few months is fairly self-evident to those of you who've been out and about. A massive fall in the amount of traffic on the road network, down by around 70% for most vehicles. Bus use has gone down even more. But what we've seen also over the last couple of months is a steady increase in the amount of traffic on the road. So HGV traffic is almost back to normal levels. Light goods vehicles is slowly getting there, boosted by lots of home deliveries that have been going on. And car use is about 2/3 to 3/4 of its previous use. Bus use is still very low, only about 20% of normal levels. And the one that a lot of people have been talking about is this massive increase in cycling we've seen, which is the top line in the graph there. But what's obvious or fairly self-evident from the slide is that cycling use has fluctuated dramatically, being driven mainly by leisure traffic at weekends and when the weather was warmer back in May. But it's still running at about 50% higher than previously. Walking, on the other hand, has collapsed. Only about 50% of the amount of walking is taking place that used to take place. And I avoided a temptation to nick one of Peter O'Driscoll's slides, but the amount of parking activity that's taking place is still about 50% of normal. But in other European countries, parking levels are almost back to where they were pre-COVID. But the overall level of traffic doesn't really tell you the full picture. And this data is taken from Dublin, but it's very similar throughout the rest of the UK. It's showing how traffic flows have changed by time of day. So in Ireland, as in the UK, the evening economy has been very badly hit. Virtually all the pubs were closed down early before general lockdown came in. And they've stayed closed mainly, and most of the leisure activities have stayed closed. So the evening traffic, the late evening traffic and overnight traffic is the traffic that's fell most and has risen least. The sort of reddish line shows you the morning peak traffic, and that has slowly creeped up to around 2/3 of its previous level. Again, partly because people are working at home, but also the schools haven't yet to go back in Ireland. But what we've seen is the off-peak traffic is starting to increase, almost not quite back to normal levels, but is still growing very strongly. So we've seen traffic levels increasing fairly steadily since the lockdown, and as the restrictions are lifted, that traffic flows have been increasing quite significantly. And what we've seen perhaps throughout this pandemic is one of the most successful public transport marketing campaigns ever. The only problem being is it's actually succeeded in getting people off public transport to the extent where even the NHS is telling people to drive. We're dealing with an obesity crisis in the UK, but still we're telling people to get in their cars and drive. And cities have adapted to the situation in various ways. So Chester has been pushing the digital way of keeping their high streets going. But some other councils we're seeing actually telling people that their car parks are free and encouraging people to drive and to use their cars. The result of all this has been an increase in the amount of pollution that's taking place on our streets. So what we've seen is, to begin with, when the lockdown came in, was a massive reduction in the amount of traffic and hence the amount of pollution. And you see that quite clearly through the middle line, which is Westminster's Oxford Street. As the retail shops all closed down, the amount of congestion and traffic declined quite dramatically. But what we're seeing is a steady increase back, not quite to usual levels of pollution, but getting there. And that's fairly worrying. These figures were from a week ago. Since then, we've had more openings taking place. So what we're expecting to see is pollution levels starting to increase back in our city centres. So one of the biggest changes that we saw during lockdown, especially anybody who lived in a major urban area, was a massive improvement in air quality. I live relatively close into central London, and just being able to see a skyline completely clear, no haze or fog, was quite an impressive sight. And the risk is we're going to lose that, and we're going to go back to how life used to be, and pollution back to previous levels unless we do something about it. And we shouldn't forget that road traffic is a key source of emissions. It's a key pollutant that occurs in our cities. And it's a situation that's slowly getting worse as people move, on the one hand, to electric vehicles, which is good. But on the other hand, they're also moving to SUVs, which are bigger, heavier vehicles using more fuel, which is a bad. And we shouldn't forget that pollution caused by vehicles is not just to do with tailpipe emissions. There's brake dust, there's tyre pollution. And it's notable that in Bergen, which had a congestion charge system, where there were exemptions for electric vehicles, they removed those exemptions because actually the pollution being caused by the congestion, even with electric vehicles, was noticeable in terms of poor air quality. And London is going the same way, that the exemptions will be removed from low emission vehicles in due course in London as well. So having lots of vehicles in our city centre is not a good thing from an air quality perspective. So what are cities doing about this? On the one hand, we're trying to retain people coming into our city centres to keep them going, supporting our city centre activities, supporting those economies. On the other hand, we've lost all that public transport capacity. People are not using public transport. Bus use, as I said, is down by about 80%. Rail is even more, it's down by 95%. So how do we get people into our city centres without clogging them up with cars? And we can't get as many people into our cities just in cars alone that we're used to be able to get there by all modes beforehand. So what we've seen, and this was a worldwide phenomena, is that road space is being taken away from cars and given to other modes of transport. And this has been done, as this particular picture shows, very simply and very easily in many cities. It's just been a case of putting down a load of traffic cones, segregating the cars away from the cyclists. And this is a continental European example, but there are lots of examples around the world of this occurring. And this is one of the reasons why we've seen an uptake in cycling. People now regard it as safer, an easier way to get around. And by introducing segregation, it's allowed people to move around more easily. But what we're also seeing is space being taken away from cars to provide that additional space. So here we see a couple of examples. One you could argue is done slightly better than the other. So one example here is London, where a lot of space has been allocated to cars and pedestrians throughout the city. There isn't much on road parking space to exist that already exists in London, so most of that space has been taken away from cars. But in other towns and cities, what we're seeing is space being taken away from road vehicles and parking. So this is an example. The other example here is not a particularly good one. It shows actually, although we're providing additional space for pedestrians and potentially cyclists to get around, we're also increasing severance. Lots of road barriers being put up, ostensibly to protect pedestrians and cyclists, but also then stopping them crossing to the other side of the street so easily. And there are problems about how do you deal with loading and unloading when parking spaces are taken out. A number of the shops and retail activities are complaining about loss of trade, which is often the case whenever parking restrictions are introduced. So it's a challenge for towns and cities. How do we deal with this situation? How do we actually make our places attractive? And we can look at some European examples where this has perhaps been done in a far better way than some of the UK examples. So here we see an example in Germany where a car park has been taken over for a concert hall, so outdoor concerts are being promoted. I'm not too sure why so much seating has been put out when most of it is then covered to say you can't use it to keep social distancing, but never mind. So, but this is a good example of how space has been used, and this is actually a Wagner opera that's under production here in Germany. The other example is in Lithuania, where they've taken a very interesting stance to reallocate a lot of public spaces to outdoor restaurants and cafes. So public squares where they were pedestrianised anyway, but in this example on a roadway where the road has been closed and provision has been made for cafes and restaurants to move in to use that space, again to keep our city's vibrant activity going and to remove vehicles from them. So improving the air quality of the environment, but also allowing economic activity to take place. And what we're seeing more and more taking place, some of you may have seen these sort of parklets that have occurred and the sort of annual parking day that takes place around the world. But this is becoming more common now and being introduced in many cities from all around the world again. So these examples are from Liverpool and Vancouver in Canada, where parking spaces have been taken out and outdoor seating space in this case is being provided. So these are under construction in both examples. So this is a response to the pandemic. How do we allow our restaurants and cafes to function with social distancing? The easiest way is to give them more outdoor space. Where do we get that outdoor space from? We take it away from parking. So we provide, not every single parking space is taken, we still provide some parking space for people, but it's a good way of introducing a bit of economic activity into our towns and cities, making them more attractive, making our streetscape more amenable to people rather than to vehicles. So we have this dilemma that cities are facing. How do they bring people into the city? How do they make it attractive? How do they support the economic activity in the city, while still providing that additional capacity for people to get in there when they can no longer use public transport? Hopefully the day will come when we can get back to using public transport, but in the meantime, using parking space to better effect, using it for economic activity rather than just leaving a car sitting in a space for a few hours is a way that many cities are going. So to try and try and improve up the air quality and address how we keep our cities going, these sort of novel approaches are being used. And so for all our cities and towns, I think that the future is quite clear. Do we want a place where everything is centered around cars? Cars become the dominant factor in the landscape. They take away space for pedestrians and people to move around, the problems with air quality. Or do we want to see our cities where people can still get around by walking and cycling in a clean environment? And how do we ensure that can occur as we move out of lockdown? So that's giving you a sort of overview of where we are, how we're moving, and how some of the cities are going forward. So with that, I'll hand back to Lewis.
Thanks very much, John. Just one follow-on question, if I may. How do you see driver behaviour being impacted by the coronavirus longer term? Do you think people will be more likely to pay higher parking charges in order to protect their health through using their cars rather than other modes of transport?
It's an interesting question. I think what we've seen is that people tend to avoid parking charges wherever possible. But now where people don't often have a choice, they're having to, or being told they need to drive everywhere. I think it'll come back to convenience. People will still pay for convenience rather than the sort of safety factor. So they still want to be able to park close to where they're going. And what we've seen is that people are prepared to pay, quite high prices to be able to park right outside the front door, wherever it is they're going to. So I think we'll see in certain segments of society a willingness to pay, but in others, and this is the dilemma that most towns and cities face, is large numbers of people have taken to online retail activities. We've already seen a switch for people for home entertainment, so people get their Netflix, or they get Deliveroo for their meals. So people are going out less as well for leisure activities. And the problem that most cities are facing, how do we address these challenges? How do we support our city centres? How do we keep them vibrant rather than people going back to almost a 1950s situation when television first came into play, and we saw a massive decline in cinema going, and we saw a decline in city centres. So it's trying to balance out changes that are taking place in society and the present problems we're seeing with mobility.
Thanks very much, John. Okay, something I should have mentioned at the start, the webinar today is being recorded and will be shared on the Landor LINKS live YouTube channel either later today or tomorrow, so look out for that. And also just a reminder that if you have any questions, then please post them in the questions area on the right of your screen. Okay, moving on to our second presentation, and now over to Dave Pye. Thanks, Dave.
According to Google Books, 45-second presentation.
Sorry that Google Home woke up then. My name's Dave Pye. I'm a consultant working in London, mainly working on local authorities, delivering parking strategies and related projects. I think one of the most common ones has been cashless parking, so I've been asked to talk today on delivering cashless parking and then moving on to things like emissions-based pricing. I think going straight in with the sort of the revenue side of it, I think after COVID recovery gets underway, we're going to be coming under quite a lot more pressure to reduce the operating costs, mainly because I think the opportunity to just ramp up parking charges wouldn't be welcomed either sort of publicly or politically. So one of the focuses on the cashless parking really is the multiple payment methods that are currently offered. You can see down the left-hand side there. When you're looking at quite a lot of local authority contract setups, the majority seem to be flat rates on transaction values. So there's no real incentive to drive up or down any of the particular payment methods, but also the benefit goes away from the local authority and towards the payment providers. I think just on the cash and note in particular, I think again with COVID, one of the opportunities now is to potentially move away from the on-street machines, mainly for the sort of reducing touch points as far as possible. Then the customer experience, I think this is probably worth starting off. The bit of a personal bugbear is laminators. If there's anybody in local authority listening where their operators have laminators in their offices, I think get them out as fast as possible. And on a customer experience side, that temporary signage appearing all over the place, it goes in seconds, but it can take years to get rid of it again. And I think that the messaging to car parking users from the start is sort of very temporary. It's not very sort of professional for the industry. And I think that leads easily on to the no return policy. You'll see it quite a lot on street and in some car parks as a way of managing the capacity and the turnover of spaces. I think one of the real benefits of going cashless is by using apps and phones, you can actually use the tariff banding to manage your turnover of spaces rather than no return. I think one of the common things that you hear back from customers is that no return policy essentially says to them, we want you for a couple of hours, spend your money and then go, and if you don't go, we'll issue you a ticket. And I think that it just brings a negative message sort of for the whole industry, not just for sort of local authorities. But it also doesn't work towards helping the high street and helping the recovery. I think if you look on the bottom left picture at the tariff board, one of the again, a big difficulty and what you see quite a lot in appeals to parking tickets is people just don't understand the huge tariff boards with all the rules on and all the different tariff banding options. Another benefit with cashless parking is that the system does it for you, and the app will tell you once you put your registration number in. It's very clear on what vehicle type you've got, if there's a particular tariff band for that, and what you've got to pay. It also gives you the opportunity to top it up. So if there isn't a limit on maximum stay, you can top it up rather than having to go back to your car. So I think that overall experience, in particular for the high streets, which is becoming increasingly important, is sort of another benefit. I think on the contract management, again, anybody that's managed parking contracts, say public or private sector, with so many different inputs and so many different payment options, you end up spending a significant amount of your time going through individual reports of all different types and standards, pivot tabling them to death to try and get them into some kind of performance report that you can use internally. So anything that can be done to reduce that gets your time back in, sort of, and allows you to focus on actually on managing and improving the contract. I think, again, moving away from the cashless into app-based or mobile phone-based or online, it's the data side of it. And when you consider some private operators will use MasterCard data and Visa data to really understand the customer, where they're going, how long they're staying, and what they're buying. The sort of app-based data that you can get, in particular on repeat customers, on dwell times and whether or not they're moving around within your borough or your city area, that kind of insight can really help you in your planning for traffic management and parking. I think once you've got your cashless parking in, you can then move on to other sort of new initiatives and other more innovative ways of managing your demand. So one of the local authorities that I've been working with in Tower Hamlets, they commissioned a parking review in 2019. One of the biggest focuses and the biggest pushes was to get through emissions-based pricing. When we first started to look at this, one of the key issues was that the pay and display machinery that we had on street was obsolete. There was no real sort of desire or funding available to upgrade the number of machines needed to service 25,000 on-street parking spaces. So the decision was made quite early on that we would go cashless and then move forward into emissions-based pricing. So the cashless was delivered in December 2019, and then the emissions-based pricing sort of early in 2020. One of the things that we did find when we started to look at the data that was provided by Ringo was that 95% of transactions for paid for parking in Tower Hamlets was already so again, looking back at the investment cost for replacing all of those machines, the numbers didn't stack up. The summary for how the delivery of cashless parking was pretty much we delivered it within a couple of months. There was no real need to drag it out with long-term consultation, infighting. One of the things that, again, we managed to find through the data was that we knew that most of the paid for parking was people travelling into the borough, mainly because the council offers quite a lot of concessions for permit holders, so that there's no real need for them to be using the pay by phone. So if we hadn't gone out to a consultation, the difficulty would have been who were we consulting and how do we reach those customers that are travelling into the borough. I think one of the sort of important things was, and it's a hesitation for quite a lot of authorities, is the kickback politically. In Tower Hamlets, we didn't get any complaints for going cashless, nothing at all. So we then moved on to the emissions-based pricing. I think everybody's declared a climate emergency now. I think everybody's looking at different ways they can respond to it within their service areas. And for parking, I think it really does need to be a mix of penalising the oldest and most polluting vehicles, but also then finding a balance to incentivise a transition over to electric and low emission. So in Tower Hamlets, again, in early 2019, we brought in an electric vehicle discount on their permits. Again, so the diesel levy came in the autumn, along with, the diesel levy on permits came in on the autumn, and then followed by cashless parking for paid parking, and then on to diesel levy. We used DVLA published data and then compared it to some sample data that Ringo pulled together for us, and we got a very clear trend that about 60% of the paid for parking was diesel cars. So again, a significant portion of that was sort of the pre-2015 diesel cars, some of the more higher polluting ones. We did actually also find one that was powered by steam, but we couldn't find any photographs of it. We looked at different modelling options and how you apply fairly a levy and sort of match that with discounting and incentivising a move and a transition to a different fuel type. We looked at particularly the Euro standards on emissions, and we came up, along with Ringo, this model where sort of if somebody has got an option to buy a newer diesel car, then they can do that and not be overly penalised. We looked at several different models, including from Westminster and Islington, quite a lot of other councils that have already done this. And after quite a lot of thought, the Mayor decided that we would move forward just with the diesel levy for now. And so we applied a 50% levy on all diesel cars from April 2020. And again, surprisingly, I think we were expecting more, but we didn't get any complaints back on the diesel levy either. Partly, I think that is down to the fact that the majority of people travelling in are coming from out of Borough, and with all of the ULEZ charges, the congestion charges, the Dartford crossing charges, everything else that comes in, there's almost an expectation of this now. So I think anyone that's got a real fear, especially in sort of the main city areas, that you're going to get a lot of kickback. From my experience in London, and particularly Tower Hamlets, that isn't the case. I think it's generally accepted by drivers that they are going to have to pay more. One of the things that we're realistic on is that it's going to be a very sort of a long and slow process to actually get people to transition. Whatever levy you put onto it, and this has been seen with ULEZ, that it takes a long time for people to make that decision to shift to a more fuel efficient, in particular moving to electric. That is a huge lifestyle change. So when we did the forecasting and the modelling for what the revenue would look like, there are very strong numbers, and obviously we're not wholly focused on numbers, but whatever levy you apply on it, I think as you move into your sort of your 5 and 10 year plans, you can start to increase the levy on the oldest cars, and then bring back up your electric car. So if you go down to sort of a flat fee of say £5 for an electric car, or free, at some point as the sort of the higher emission and the low emission comes to meet, you're going to have to sort of shift the pricing plans to meet. So one of the things that we're upfront with from the start is that long-term plan to draw those prices together and not have a shock at some point further down the line in 10-15 years time where suddenly all the pricing plans change again. So I think politically that was a little bit safer, because we were upfront with that from the start about how we would transition that moving forward. And again, the data that we can get out of that system is fantastic. Tower Hamlets uses Ringo. The reporting that you can get from that, the analysis that you can do on how people are moving around the borough, really helps you to plan sort of your major road improvement schemes, your parking schemes, and it's led into reviews of other things like controlled parking zones and how they operate. I think the cashless parking and emissions-based pricing combined, once that is all done, you can then start to look at things, other ways of managing that demand. And I think there's so many different things on the market with sensors in bays, or even vehicles driving around monitoring bays. I think there's other opportunities that you can use with app-based systems, even moving towards capacity-based pricing or emission-based pricing. So if your air quality is very, very bad in a particular time of the year, you raise the pricing to try and disincentivize people from driving in. And that can be done much easier with one supplier, and is more sort of responsive to sort of the day-to-day need. I think that was me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dave. Just got one question for you following that. How do you deal with different political influences during projects?
Parking's a hot topic on everybody's agenda. Everybody hates parking enforcement until they need it. Everybody hates paying for parking until they can't park. So I think that what I've found with working with different authorities of different colours, that they all seem to have rightly the same priority, that residents are kings and residents should be provided for. I think from a consultant point of view and from the officer's point of view, one of the sort of the most challenging things, but sometimes can be the most fun thing, is making it really clear that our job is to balance the need of all the different users and not just focus on one. And you do run a real risk of destroying a high street very quickly with one wrong move. If you don't properly balance those different needs, then obviously you can a shopping centre with thousands and thousands of free spaces. So the biggest challenge politically is getting that message across sort of in a robust way, and quite a lot of that can be done in sort of using business groups. I think sort of there's sometimes a reluctance to go out and speak to residents groups directly and speak to business groups. In Tower Hamlets, some of the changes that we made there, we went with the head of service and we printed out a very, very long public engagement session with hundreds of very angry residents. And I think even though they didn't wholly agree with what we were saying, they appreciated more the fact that we'd come and had that argument and had that debate with them and explained ourselves. So I think that sort of, for the people with really keen interest in parking, most people do have in one way or another. I think for me, it's the face-to-face. It's not just sending them a letter. I think it's getting out there with the politicians in front of them and finding out the real issues.
Okay, thanks very much, Dave. Just a reminder that if you have any questions, then please post them into the question box. Okay, moving on to our final presentation. I'd like to introduce Pete O'Driscoll, who's the Managing Director of Ringo. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you very much, Lewis. Yes, I'm the Managing Director for Ringo in the UK, and I've been with the business now for 11 years. During that time, we've seen quite a lot of things change in terms of both what our clients want, but also what our end users come to expect from us, both as a service provider, but also as someone playing a responsible role in helping local authorities and residents live in a clean environment. So I'm just going to quickly share with you, I think most of you may have seen these maps in the various media outlets that are out there. If you look at 2016 and the nitrogen oxide levels, they were quite high. COVID has come along, and as Dave alluded to and John alluded to, people have got used to clean air and have come to expect their environment to be in a much better place than it was pre-COVID. And one of the sacrifices and changes we've got from this whole crisis has been the need to put people's health back at the forefront of people's agendas. But already we can see as the economy starts to recover and the traffic volumes start to go up and return to normal levels, the pollutant levels are going back up again. And as a result of this, local authorities need to do something about it, as it's in their power and gift. I think the challenge you've got is how do you balance increased car usage, freedom of choice, and also how do you integrate this in with ultra low emission zones or controlled parking zones. The government's announced already that any expansion of the current London ULEZ will be delayed until next year, and other cities like York, who are looking at these schemes coming into play, and Birmingham as well, and Oxford, have had to put these schemes back due to the need to support the high street. With that in mind, local authorities need to look, I think, at local schemes that can be adapted a lot more quickly and readily, and are flexible to implement, don't require much capital infrastructure, and can be tailored to the local level. And by tailored, that means it can reflect your local policy towards particular vehicle types or green vehicles. So how does it work? Quite simply, we've been working with different councils, admittedly predominantly London ones, over the last 3 years to deliver emission-based parking to councils. The flavours of this vary depending on which authority you talk to. Some authorities like Westminster and Camden went for a percentage uplift, whereas Islington went for a flat fee increase of £2, subsequently moved up to £3 per hour for diesel vehicles. And then you had the City of London, who adopted a different policy and approach, which is quite unique in as much as that they've also incentivised clean vehicles and also some less polluting diesel cars over the older petrol cars and more polluting diesel vehicles. When a user goes to park, it's quite simple. We do a look up to the DVLA, and that pulls back the fuel type and vehicle type, and then the pricing is calculated. We make sure that the user is aware that they are having a surcharge applied or a discount applied through a prompt in the app. Equally, if you use the IVR, which is the automated phone line payment system, you'll also get the prompt enunciated to you on the IVR that you're paying for a polluting vehicle when you park your vehicle. In terms of the impact and how it works, we've just got 2 examples here of London boroughs who have implemented emission-based parking and those who haven't. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, in the case of Islington and Camden, you can see a noticeable drop in diesel vehicles coming in from when their schemes get launched. Conversely, if you look at the right-hand side, Barking and Dagenham and Lewisham, where there have been no emission-based schemes, the number of diesel vehicles coming into the area has continued to rise without stopping. And I think it does begin to show you that having an emission-based parking scheme does lead to a reduction in emissions in your borough. In terms of the impact on traffic, we've got some data here from the Mayor's office looking at the consultation around ULEZ and also the impacts on traffic movements. Now, the ULEZ began in April 19, it started being implemented across central London area, and we can see that traffic levels have fallen around that time. But also, if you look at the emission-based programs that rolled out, you could see that traffic levels are starting to come down already prior to the ULEZ zone coming in. And we do believe that is in part result of the emission-based parking programs that have been delivered in Islington, in Camden, and the full rollout in Westminster. But also, if we're looking a bit further still in terms of the impact, going down, looking at the quarterly level, you can see that the levels did come away. So in 2017, Q3, we launched the Westminster trial in one parking zone. And we can now see that in February 20, we see the different schemes coming out in Islington, Camden, City of London, and more recently Tower Hamlets. We can see there's been a 44% drop over the 3-year period of nitrogen oxide emissions. And that is based on parking pre and post ULEZ. So you can see the impact and effect of emission-based parking pulling through here. So how do we help councils? We have quite a big wealth of data, and we're able to cut our data by duration, emissions, enforcement level of enforcement taking place in the authority, and we can begin to see and map out your true parking landscape. And when you move to almost full cashless provision across your borough or district or council, you can get a real decent picture building up. And therefore, when you're looking at your policy, you have real data to make an informed decision on as to what type of vehicles you want to target. There's no use, for example, deciding that you're going to target dirty diesel vehicles if when you look at your data sets, most of the vehicles coming into your city are, say, a 2017, 2018 registration. That won't work against targeting older diesel vehicles because they're already out of your city. And here, this gives you some insights. So this is the particular borough taking a point around the emission types, where we looked at the vehicle registration and the emissions. And this particular council that we're working with here wanted originally to target anything that was non-Euro 6 compliant, which is a 2015 diesel. And you can see here, if you look at the spread of data in the heat maps, that the bulk of the vehicles that they have are post 2015. Therefore, it was critical that when we worked with them to implement a policy, that we designed a policy that was suited to the users in their borough, not just what was being asked of them or what was the sort of political soundbites at that point in time. And armed with this information, you can deliver an efficient emission-based parking scheme. And here, this is my last slide. I've kept it relatively brief because I know we've had people talking for some time today. But you can see here the tail off and improvements. So in January 2018, this is a typical dashboard, by the way, for a local authority that works with us. So in 2018, Islington introduced a £2 per hour diesel surcharge. You can see that they're doing around about 74,000 sessions prior to that point. A year later, they decided they wanted to be more aggressive and target those diesel vehicles further and increase the charge by a further £1. And you can see here the number of sessions starting to come away. And throughout the whole of 2018, you see the number of diesel vehicles dropping. Now, it's fair to say that while sessions drop, which results in less traffic going through, the higher charge usually offsets that drop. And from our own experience and working with some of the councils, we tend to see that there's about an 18-month to 24-month drag along before that effect takes place. But what we'll do with you through our account management team and sales team is work very closely with you as a council, monitoring both your income levels, but also the vehicle types and sessions coming into the borough. So that's how we kind of work with everybody, and hopefully that's a good way of us providing, some insight into how to operate your emission-based parking program or policy should you decide to go forward with it as a policy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pete. Just in terms of follow-on question, how much does it cost to implement your emissions-based permit scheme?
So for the emission-based parking scheme, it will vary by local authority. And why is that? Because we have to undertake a lookup with the DVLA, which costs us money to undertake that lookup. And so what we'll do is we look at the number of sessions that are in place in the borough, and then from there we will come up with a pricing program based around the envisaged number of lookups we see taking place. And in terms of the setup, it's usually a consultation piece. It's not very big. It's in the low thousands as a cost to set up. It's not expensive at all.
Okay, thanks, Pete.
Right.
Great. That concludes the presentations, and we'll now move on to the question and answer section. So thanks to those of you who've already submitted your questions, and if anybody else has got any questions, then please do put them into the questions section on the right-hand side of your screen. The first question's from Neil Heron. Has the time now come for cities to regulate curbside freight activity by requiring commercial freight operators to book their curbside delivery slots? Pete, I'll probably pass that one to you.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're looking at a piece of work with one authority at the moment around the nighttime economy. And what I mean by that is deliveries. At the moment, what we see, if I look at some of our data we have in Ringo, we see big surges of white commercial vehicles or LCVs coming in to the cities between 8 and 2 or 3 in the daytime. And there's a discussion going on. It congests the roadside up, but can we move those delivery slots? And I think leading on to Neil's point here is then come up with a charging mechanism around that. So I think what we'll begin to see is some different charging by vehicle type as opposed to pre-booked slots initially, to see what appetite there is for it, and will that change the shift in people's modes of operation and delivery? Because ultimately, if you invest heavily in one of these schemes and people don't change their patterns, and your objective is to move freight or light commercial vehicles to a different time of the day, you need to sort of do a gentle touch first to see if that has an impact before you look at a more advanced scheme. That answers the question.
Thanks, Pete. Moving on to the next one. How can local businesses, high streets, work collaboratively with the local authority and the parking authorities to encourage sustainable trips, whilst also helping to kickstart local economies? John, I'll probably pass that one your way.
So I think that the key question here is a better understanding of how people get to retail outlets. So the assumption for many shop owners and businesses that everybody comes in by car, but there's been lots of surveys to show that's not the case. And actually most of their revenue comes from non-car users. So I think the first point is to actually understand where people are coming from, making sure you've got an attractive offer to them. And again, the evidence shows that parking charges often don't relate to the offer that's available in a local high street that people are prepared to pay if they've got a decent retail offer to go to. So it's making sure that the amount you're charging for things like parking reflect the quality of the retail offer or the leisure offer that you've got in a particular location. So understanding how people get to your locations in the first place, and then making sure your charges are appropriate to the offer, I think are the two key factors that businesses and local authorities need to work on.
Thanks, John. And that question was from Daniel Simpson. Thanks very much for that, Daniel. Another one here from Jean Psycho, and apologies if I pronounce your surname incorrectly. Claiming parking spaces will have a detrimental effect on local authority financial resources, and the temptation to increase business taxes will be high. Any thoughts? Dave, would you like to have a go at that one?
I think the business tax is beyond my experience. I think the challenge for the high street businesses, and I think following on from the last question, I think is how those businesses can get involved. I think it's actually engaged with the authorities. I've worked in local authorities up and down the country, and getting businesses to come and engage and come and talk through some of the plans and some of the options is very difficult. You can sit in a room of 10 people for a city centre high street. So I think that getting involved in the discussion at an early stage is important. But the charging side isn't the be all and end all for the high street. There are other ways to manage the traffic. The charging is always going to be there in one way or another, but using things like capacity pricing, capacity-based pricing incentives, that will help change peaks and troughs in usage of the high street. So potentially those who don't have to travel in the same way as you use concessionary passes for older and disabled people, their travel is limited to after 9:30 free. So you can start then to manage your arrival and departure profile on the high street, which spreads the day out, which would make it it'd be easier for businesses then to sort of transition their offers as well and become more dynamic in not just how they price, but how they sort of pitch that to the customers. So I think that really it's the engagement. It's coming and talking to people when these consultations come out. It's getting that consultation level right and having that conversation and being open and honest rather than a shouting match in a public meeting. It's nice to sort of get the ideas and come up with bespoke ideas for bespoke areas. No two high streets are the same. So there is opportunity there. It's just come and talk.
Thanks, Dave. On to the next one. Does COVID-19 mean that almost all users now prefer cashless payment systems? If so, how do you cater for the minority who still want to use cash? I think that's one for you there, Pete.
Yeah, sure. I think it's not just about parking. I think it's a lot of payments. I mean, I had the lucky opportunity to go into a pub at the weekend, and when I got there, I couldn't use my cash. I couldn't use my card. I had to use an app. So I think COVID is going to change people's patterns of behaviour. And if you're looking at different generations and how they behave and interact and purchase and buy goods, we already see big shifts to a cashless society. And I think parking is just one of those categories that's caught in the same bucket. Parking was further ahead though, because the cashless revolution, if you want to call it that, it began some time ago. And if we really look at the last 5 or 6 years, it's really gathered momentum and pace. But to answer the specific point about people who maybe don't have a mobile phone or don't want to use a cashless parking solution, we do have a couple of retail solutions that we have in the market. We partner with PayPoint for one solution, and we also partner with our own in-house solution that we've had for 3 years. It's been operating in Islington, where they took the decision to remove machines 2 or 3 years ago, and we've had a retail alternative or our outlet solution for those people who want to go into a shop and pay for parking. So there is a solution there, but general experience and from engaging with our own user bases, that they want to use a phone parking solution, A, because it means you're not touching surfaces, so it's reducing touch points, but B, primarily the convenience of it all, that if you're away from your vehicle, you can extend and deal with the need to not rush back to your car.
Thanks, Pete. And if you don't mind staying on for this next one as well, given the climate emergency, is Ringo seeing any interest in CO2-based charges for all users? Diesel charges only have NOx benefits.
That's a really good question, and probably a very pertinent one. What we're seeing, and I think what will happen, is a two-phased approach, and it will depend on where you are as an authority in terms of when you go to implement your emission-based parking program or not. I think if you're looking at emission-based parking in 2 years' time, then I think you'll see the schemes there will be CO2-based, whereas the historic schemes have been focused on getting the diesel vehicles out of the cities because of the harmful pollutants that are there. But you're quite right, CO2 is going to come, and in the graph I showed or shared a couple of slides back, that is a council we're talking to that has emission-based parking, is actually saying to us, hey, we want to look at going to CO2-based program. What does that look like? And that's twofold, really. One, they've had the effect they wanted to have on diesel coming out of their borough, and B, they want to make sure that everybody is penalised or incentivised in the right way based on their vehicle choice that they bring into a town centre.
Thanks, Pete. And that one was from Robert Mason. Thanks, Robert. The next one's for you, John. COVID-19 has seen a drop in public transport use. Does it follow that higher parking charges are inevitable to discourage more car trips?
Not necessarily. I think that there's a couple of different policies that local authorities are adopting. So one is to actually take out parking spaces, reallocate that space for, as we saw, that the sort of expansion of restaurants and cafes, or provide that space for pedestrians and cyclists. And if there's no parking space, then you can't park. You don't bring your car into a city in the first place. So that's one way of dealing with it. The other one, which is a sort of more interesting one, and we've heard a lot about, from Dave and Pete, about differential charging for diesel vehicles and polluting vehicles. And the question is, are we actually hitting hard the lower income people who tend to have cars which are older and for longer and tend to be more polluting? And it's picking up sort of Neil Heron's idea, can you actually move to a system where parking space is rationed by other means than just price? So you pay a price for your parking, but do you book your parking in advance? And if those parking spaces have gone, that's it, and you don't use price. So there are different mechanisms of how to allocate scarce capacity. Charging is obviously the easiest one, and it brings revenue in. But there are other ways of looking at the problem as well, and seeing if we can ensure that our cities are available to everybody, not just the wealthy who can afford to pay, high parking charges.
Thanks, John. And then the next one, is the delay in the rollout of clean air zones a cause for concern? That's a question from Mark Moran, and I'll pass that one to you, Dave.
I think it depends on your view on the clean air zones and the levies that come with it. I think the delay comes at the same time as throughout the lockdown period, there's been fewer cars on the road. I think it's already been explained about the fact that public transport's running at probably roughly 10% of capacity, so people are travelling by alternative means. So car use is going to rapidly go up, and it's probably going to be with us for a lot longer. I'm not convinced that when we're advising people to use the cars more because currently it's safer to do it, it's right then to overly penalise them on things like the clean air zone and the ULEZ charges, particularly in London. So I think you've got to, again, it goes back to that sort of accessibility for low income and more vulnerable people. If we're going to start ramping some of these sort of movement charges up in at the same time as parking, you're pricing people out of being able to drive at the same time as you're telling people to drive. So on the clean air thing, I think it's sort of a much wider discussion based on sort of individuals' views on whether it's the right thing to do. I'm not convinced of it at the minute.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Next question is from Zolthus. How are the needs of disabled people who need their cars being taken into account? Pete, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk at this probably from a system application level as opposed to a policy level, but from a system application level, we have the ability to, you know, if a user identifies themselves as being a blue badge holder, we can offer differential pricing for that user. So from an application perspective, we can manage it. And there is the ongoing debate about where's your central data source, where do you get the list from, and different councils have different policies. So there's one council I know has a brown badge, which is which is a resident disabled badge, and then they allow blue badge and green badges in. So they have different policies for different resident types based on where they live, irrespective of the fact that the 3 user groups that I've just mentioned there are all blue badge holders. So that is one of the challenges we have in terms of implementing a scheme from a policy level, but at a system application, we're able to treat it, certainly with the Ringo application, is quite unique in that we can look at different tariff tables, just as we do for emission-based parking, whether it's CO2 driven, which is what we had in place in Richmond in 2009. You know, now it's quite some time ago, but we can still, you know, differentiate by user group or particular. So if there's, for example, resident cards as well. So no matter what user group we want to try and identify, we can at an application level at least administer that through a tariff perspective, whether it be free parking or discounted parking, we can manage that.
Thanks, Pete. Another one from Zolthus. How do you think that current and planned changes, for example, sections of road closures to allow for cycle lanes or the introduction of clean air zones, will affect blue badge holders who perhaps were using that space for access and parking? John, one for you.
I think this is, again, it comes back to this problem about how do you make best use of your road space and curbside space. You know, some of the examples I showed where, you know, local authorities have put out loads of steel barriers to prevent use of that space by vehicles, actually causes lots of problems for loading, unloading, as well as for blue badge holders. And it's making sure that we have the right balance, you know, and flexibility in our road space, that the space is available to those who do need it, and don't have an alternative. And so, you know, it's great that local authorities have reacted very quickly by putting in additional cycling and pedestrian provision, but often, you know, the loading, unloading, and the blue badge holders get forgotten about when they're doing that. And it's how you actually make a system that's flexible enough, which achieves what you want to do, but doesn't disadvantages those who, as I say, you know, need to actually get their vehicles into our town centres.
Thank you. And then a question for all, which I'll probably ask each of you for your view on. What level of parking discount should councils offer electric vehicles? I'll come to you first, Pete.
Very good question. I think my answer would be, where does the council or operator wish to leave their overall parking budget, what effect they wish to have on vehicle movements in and out of their borough. People aren't going to suddenly rush out and buy electric tomorrow because of a free incentive. I think it's a gradual shift, as we saw with diesel. There is sort of a 3, 9, 10-month lag. But to answer your question, what is the discount level? I think it really depends on your own policy. You know, I think if your policy is to go green and have net zero emission parking, then you'd offer a much more aggressive discount. But typically, you know, we've had discussions with councils who've indicated somewhere between, you know, 10-20% discount all the way up to you know, 50% discount. It really depends on your policy.
Thanks, Pete. And John, your view?
So I would go for the economist answer, which would be none. You know, the reason why we charge is because there's scarce capacity, and you know, how do you allocate that capacity? And it seems to me that there are a whole load of other environmental issues with electric cars. You know, where do the batteries come from? You know, how do you deal with that? Actually making the vehicle in the first place is still very carbon intensive. So electric vehicles aren't a panacea for climate change or for air quality. You know, as I said before, Bergen, which had discounts for electric vehicles on its congestion charge system, has removed them because the pollution actually caused by electric vehicles is still considerable when you take into account brake dust and tire dust, etc. So the reason why you have parking charges is to manage scarce capacity, and providing discounts for any particular type of user is generally, from an economics point of view, not a good thing. There are other factors which drive people's choice of vehicles rather than parking charges.
Thanks, John. And Dave.
Yeah, I think just following again from John's point, that it depends what you're trying to achieve, but charging for parking isn't the default. The default is you're trying to manage capacity and the sort of the balance of differing needs. I think quite a lot of times there's an obvious incentive for local authorities to do it, but you use charging as we've got a space, that's it, we'll charge for it, not what can it be used for, and what is the need in that area. So I think that the discounting for electric vehicles, again, are you trying to reduce car use, or are you trying to transition, mode shift people into more fuel efficient cars? So if you're trying to reduce use of the car and shift to active travel or public transport, then offering that discount isn't incentivizing people to do that. So sort of going back to both of the points from Pete and John, it's a policy decision for that local high street, for that bespoke area, about what you're trying to achieve. And I think it goes back to my main point earlier on about understanding exactly what that high street needs and responding to it. Because some high streets, especially local district centres, charging is completely the wrong thing to do. It'll kill a small centre, but a high street with much more demand and it continuing throughout the week, then charging is the right thing to do to force that turnover.
Thanks, Dave. And if you wouldn't mind staying on for the next one, sorry, I lost my place in the screen there. Yes, another one from Mike Moran. With traffic levels rising and some pop-up cycling routes now reportedly being removed, could the moment for remodelling the street scene in many places have already passed?
No, I think now is a really good opportunity to start looking back at the streetscape and where you can improve it. I think government made a decision, I think it was early on last year, to try and put the brakes on shared space. I think the idea of shared space is a good idea. Segregation is sort of old hat. The idea of moving as much infrastructure as possible out of the way and just letting people get on with their lives is actually quite a good idea. It works in many areas. I think especially Europe, continental Europe and Spain, you go around any of those areas, so it looks chaotic, but it works. So I think in the UK we went over cautious with infrastructure, and you've got guardrails and traffic lights at every possible opportunity. I think that there is a chance now to re-look at shared space and how it can be applied properly in the UK. So not rushing back into it, but there is a chance now with COVID, with this real push for active travel, and now start to look at streetscape and see how you can improve it and change it. And just harking back to the cashless parking side of it, one of the real benefits of cashless parking is you can reduce signage clutter and everything that goes with it, and road markings, and you can use zone-based signage options. So that idea of removing barriers and then just letting people park within a zone, it relies on some sensibility which you can still enforce, but you don't necessarily need all of the signs and lines and mess that usually comes with it.
Thanks, Dave. This question is from George Bow, and it'll be one for you, Pete. How is accessibility to cashless payments managed, i.e. people with no access to technology or people who are less comfortable with using technology? So how are they catered for?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of how we manage that, I think I touched on earlier that we have a relationship with PayPoint. So how do they get to those solutions? It's usually done through signage. So where there is a Ringo option on the side of the road and no pay and display machine, it will offer you your nearest location potentially as one way of dealing with it. But outside of that, it is what it is. You had the same debate and question around public transport. You know, buses don't take coins and haven't done for years. So, you know, and I remember when that came in, there was quite a big furore around the fact that you couldn't pay for your bus fare using coins anymore. And we've coped. Society's moved on, and arguably people on public transport, not everybody, but they're in some of those groups that might have some struggles to access to technology without wanting to make any aspersions. So I think for me, it's people will find the way.
Okay, thank you. And if you don't mind staying on for the next one, question from Jenny Mindell. How much of this in relation to your slides, Pete, how much of the fall was due to ULEZ and how much to the COVID-19 lockdown? Presumably, if it's ULEZ, it won't go up as much even if travel returns to previous levels.
Okay, so the good thing about the emission-based schemes is a few of them were in before before ULEZ came into play. So we saw that the drops happening before ULEZ came in. I think when ULEZ came in, it's interesting. I think it reinforced the behaviour that was already happening. And I know the City of London in particular, where much of the ULEZ zone covers, the initial introduction of EBP did see a sharp reduction in the higher polluting vehicles before the ULEZ scheme was introduced. I think what's going to be more interesting, and this is probably a topic of conversation for many of those who might call the inner London boroughs, i.e. inside the North-South Circular, when that ULEZ charge gets extended to that boundary, what effect will that have on people? Because arguably, if you're paying to go into the city in such a big area, you might as well stay in and drive around for the day and park up. So I think the ULEZ zone, as it expands, may have a different effect to the one we see today, as a kind of forward-thinking comment.
Thanks, Pete. There's a question here from Ruth Mayer-Cass. Is any work being done on delivery times? And this is sort of delivery of goods, etc. My experience of Europe is that it is regulated, whereas here it is a free-for-all, meaning much street space is taken up by Tesco's, DPD, local butchers, etc. Surely this has to change. It's a question for you, John, I think.
So we do have some regulation about when goods vehicles are allowed to move in certain locations, and we obviously have loading and unloading restrictions. You know, what we've also seen, however, is this tendency for just-in-time deliveries. So you'll see at supermarket chains, you know, large HGVs parked up some distance away from them, waiting for their time to actually come in and deliver their goods. So, you know, again, it comes back to, you know, how do we make best use of our curb space? And, you know, businesses to survive do need deliveries. And the question is, can those deliveries be timed at times which are convenient both for the business and for road users? And it comes back to some of the ideas that, you know, we talked about at the very beginning with sort of Neil Heaven's question. You know, can we move to a system of booking space for vehicles for delivering? So it's not a free fall on the curb space, but we are supporting businesses by allowing them to deliver when they need to, but also at not a time which is causing congestion to traffic moving on the road network. So it's a case of sort of regulation, but again, this flexibility we've talked about before. You know, how do businesses and local authorities work together to the benefit of all to make things work in a much better and more flexible way? I think, you know, we can't forget that, you know, deliveries are vital to support businesses, and we can't just stop them and expect life to continue as normal.
Sure. There's another question here from Mark Moran around the, I think it relates to the implementation of clean air zones and whether the joint air quality unit centralised payment system would be ready, or whether council should prepare backup schemes. Certainly from my own experience, we're not quite sure what form that will take yet, but it's clearly going to be a really important interface for the successful operation of these schemes. Pete, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think there is going to be delays to the schemes coming in, and I think we will possibly see a fallback to the more flexible solutions. And one thing we might see coming in, it's an idea that's happening in France at the moment as a different way of dealing with this kind of pollution challenge, is to have pollution days. And what happens there is when the pollutants get to a certain level in the city, they actually make it free for residents to park, so they're not driving their cars around, and they make it more expensive for people from outside, I believe, of the R&D sponsors to pay for parking. So what we might see is, they call it surge charging, dynamic pricing, pollution-based pricing. You might see other mechanisms that are a lot cheaper to implement being introduced across citywide areas, so they can then have a universal theme or coverage.
Thanks, Pete. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. So thank you very much to our presenters and also to all of you who've listened in and asked questions. I think that's been really, really great. I'm going to give each of the presenters just the opportunity to make one final comment. So Dave, we'll go to you first.
Well, one of them would be, when you're doing a presentation, turn your smart speaker off. But I think just the main conflict and the main issue that we came up with cashless parking was payment methods for vulnerable people. I think we have to move with technology, and I think that the key point for me throughout all of the different reviews we've been doing has been you've got to almost be unapologetic about what you're doing and really stand firm by it. There will always be somebody that will come up with some other problem and some other reason why you can't do things like going cashless, but balancing all of the needs, it is a really good move, and for councils to be more innovative and to be able to move into better ways of managing traffic, you have to do it. And if you need a consultant to do it, I know a good one.
Thanks, Dave. And John, a closing comment, if you will.
I think what we're going to see going forward is a diversion of opinions really between two different viewpoints. One is that the economy needs to recover rapidly, and therefore anything will go, and we need to get cars back into our town centres, and we reduce parking charges, and we just let anything happen. And that way leads back to where we were before with pollution and all the other problems and congestion. The other alternative is we've seen some radical ideas come forward by local authorities to say, no, well, that's not going to happen. We're going to take space away from vehicles. We're going to allow more pedestrians, more cycling to take place in our town centres. That's the future that we see, which addresses both climate change and the air quality problems that our city centres face. So it'll be interesting to see which argument wins out and which of those towns and cities perform best, those who go back to life as it was before, or those who seize an opportunity to do something completely different.
Thanks, John. And then to wrap things up, Pete, a final comment from you, please.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank Landor for organising this event and seminar, and I hope that all the audience on the call have taken something out of it. I'd also like to thank David and John and Lewis for hosting. Really appreciate that. But in terms of a final point from us and how we see the world, or certainly how Ringo is going to be acting in the future, Ringo's intention is to become more involved in mobility payments, covering what other sectors and other spaces. And what you will see, I think, from us is a move from just being a simple, and I use the word simple very lightly, my IT colleagues would have thanked me for it, being a payment provider to one that's actually providing more services, but also can support local authorities in looking at how they tackle road congestion, whether that be through parking or looking at our data to help analyse that. So we're here to help, and thank you for your time today, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Great. Well, thank you again to the presenters. That was really fascinating topics and discussion. Thanks to everybody for dialing in. It would be remiss of me not to remind you of the next webinar in this series, which is the Digital Service and Touchless Transactions webinar, which is taking place on the 16th of July. So please do look out for the notifications on that. So thanks again, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.